Welcome to Chapter 8, The Joints of the Skeletal System. I want to remind you that the beginning of your textbook, in the beginning of each chapter of your textbook, there is a section at the very beginning of either the very top of either the first or second page that has commonly used vocabulary for this chapter. If you have not been doing so already, I encourage you to look at that information at the beginning of each chapter so you can see which medical terms are most commonly used in this with this topic. That doesn't mean that this is the only time you'll see it, but these are the terms that are most commonly used in this section, and that will help you learn the different parts of the body even better. All right, let's get into it. So when you're talking about joints, remember that joints are the locations where two bones meet. That is the definition of a joint. It is the place where two bones meet or two bones articulate. When we say that bones articulate, we're basically saying that the end of one bone is connecting with the end of another bone. That's it. All right. So articulations of bones are joints. There are functional connections between each bones. Um, these bind the skeletal system together. Again, a joint is a location where two bones come together. So that is how your skeletal system is built, by the connections of these different bones. These joints make bone growth possible. Remember when we talked about the epiphyseal plate in chapter 7, we talked about this being the place of articulation and where the bone grows. All right. It permits parts of the skeleton to change shape during childbirth. Remember, when a child goes through the birth canal, the bones of the skeleton, I'm sorry, of the skull, they are not fused the way they are in adults. Instead of fusing with each other, they are connected by this interosseous membrane that keeps the bones together. And because there's a membrane serving as the joint between these bones, it allows that skeleton to change shape when the child goes through the birth canal. And joints enable the body to move in response to skeletal muscle contractions. So your skeletal muscles will always cross a joint. So your muscles will attach at one joint on one end. I'm sorry, will attach to one bone on one end, and the other end of that muscle will attach to a different bone. And because they cross a joint, when they contract, that allows the movement of the bones. Therefore, it allows your movement. You have many different types of joints in the body, and they all vary quite a bit in both structure, how they look, and function, how they move. They're classified both by structure and function. So, again, structure meaning um, how the bones are bound together at each joint, what type of tissue is used at each joint, or how it moves, what degree of movement it has. That's the functional classification. So, does it move very little? Does it move not at all? Does it move freely? That is the functional classification of joints. The structural and functional classifications do overlap. So, as you're studying it, keep that in mind that they do overlap. So, you'll notice the difference between the different terms, but again, structure and function will overlap. Usually we'll use the structural classification of joints, but you also must know the functional, so that when you're talking to other medical professionals, you'll have an idea of what we're talking about. So the structural classification of joints, you have three structural classifications. You have fibrous joints, cartilaginous joints, and synovial joints. Now, you should be relatively familiar with the fibrous joints, fibrous joints and cartilaginous joints. Even though you don't necessarily know the joints themselves, you know what fibrous tissue is, you know what cartilaginous tissue is, and that'll be helpful. If you don't remember, please go back to chapter 5, the tissues chapter, and brush over those so that you can, so that these can become more familiar to you. So your fibrous joints are your dense connective tissues. These are the ones that connect the bones using mostly collagenous fibers. This occurs at bones that are in close contact with one another. And we'll talk more specifically about that as we continue. Cartilaginous joints have either hyaline cartilage or fibrocartilage that connects the bones. And then you have the synovial joints that are the most complex joints in the body. These are the ones that allow free movement. So you have the most movement at a joint in the synovial joints. Now, for the functional classifications, you have how much movement the joint allows. Synarthrotic joints are immovable. These are joints that don't move at all, or they move so little that we can't see it. Amphiarthrotic joints are slightly movable, so they move very little. And then you have the diarthrotic joints that are freely movable. So again, structural classification named by what it's made of, fibrous, cartilaginous, synovial joints. Functional classifications, how much does it move? Synarthrotic, amphiarthrotic, diarthrotic. Talking about fibrous joints, so that first classification of the first one of the structural classification of joints, you have 3 different types of fibrous joints. You have syndesmosis. Syndesmosis, you have the suture, and then you have gomphosis. So your syndesmosis is a joint made up of long fibers that connect bones together. Long fibers that connect bones together. These long fibers are your dense connective tissues. If you remember, the structures that are some of the more prominent structures that are made up of these dense connective tissues are tendons and ligaments. So as you see here, you have this interosseous membrane that is a syndesmosis. You also have this interosseous ligament that is a syndesmosis. So these are made up of these dense connective tissues. They are amphiarthrotic. Go back, we see that amphiarthrotic are slightly movable. So in these syndesmoses, you have some movement of the bones, but not a whole lot. In this particular case, it's flexible. It may allow the bones to twist. So when you're talking about the tibia and fibula, these are the bones of the lower leg. You have some ability to twist those bones on each other, creating that slight twisting motion. All right, so interosseous ligaments, interosseous membranes, made up of dense connective tissues, connecting bones together. Your sutures are only found between the flat bones of the skull. So when someone is born, they don't have these sutures. Remember that there are interosseous membranes that connect these bones together. And this allows the baby to go through the birth canal with more ease. This also allows the baby's brain to grow without being impeded by a bony structure. So once those fontanelles close, they close in the form of these sutures. These sutures are synarthrotic, meaning they don't move. Or if they do move, it's so little movement that it's not really perceptible. There is a thin layer of connective tissue that connects these bones together. So in these sutures, there will be this thin layer of connective tissues that we may not be able to see with our naked eye, or at least not in this image, but just know that that is sort of the glue that is holding everything together and making it more immovable. Then you have gymphosis. Gymphosis, I always hear gum when I hear the word gymphosis. These are cone-shaped bony processes in a bony socket. So the socket that your teeth grow in is a gymphosis joint. Gymphosis joint. So your tooth in your teeth in your jaw bones, whether it's the mandible or the maxilla, the root of the tooth is in your gymphosis. I'm sorry, in the socket, creating that gymphosis joint, and that's held together by a ligament. So if you notice here between the skull, the bones in the skull, in the jaw, and the tooth, you have these ligaments that hold the two structures together. This is also a synarthrotic joint, also known as an immovable joint. So the three joints of the three types of fibrous joints, you have your syndesmosis, which are your dense connective tissue that are amphiarthrotic. You have your sutures that are synarthrotic, and then you have your gomphoses that are also synarthrotic. You have your cartilaginous joints that are the second type of structural classification. So again, these are made primarily of hyaline cartilage and fibrocartilage. There are two different types of cartilaginous joints. You have synchondrosis and symphysis. Your synchondrosis is a synarthrotic joint that are bands of hyaline cartilage that unite bone. So your epiphyseal plate is a type of synchondrosis. Remember, con meaning cartilage. This is a temporary structure because obviously after the growth plates close, these are no longer cartilaginous. They're no longer growth plates. They're just osseous bones. Then you also have synchondrosis between the manubrium and the first rib. This is a permanent structure. So this is the manubrium. This is the first rib. This is the cartilage that connects the two. So you have your synchondrosis. Synchondrosis. All right, bands of hyaline cartilage that unite bones. Then there's the symphysis. Symphysis is a pad of fibrocartilage that connects two bones. You have symphysis joints in your symphysis pubis. So the two halves of your hip bones anteriorly come together to form the pubic symphysis. So it's telling you that it is a symphysis joint. It is pubic, which means that it is in your pubic area, just to help you remember what it is and where it is. If you put your hand on your lower pelvis, in the middle of that is this symphysis pubis that is joining the two halves of your hip bone. You also have a symphysis between the bodies of your vertebrae. So your intervertebral discs are also considered symphysis joints. These are amphiarthrotic because they do allow limited movement. It's just not much, definitely not freely movable. All right, we definitely wouldn't want this joint to move too much because then that wouldn't provide the level of stability that we want and need in our hip joints, as well as between our vertebrae. So now the third type of Let's go back. The third type of structural classification, we already talked about the fibrous joints. We just finished talking about the cartilaginous joints. And now we'll talk about the synovial joints. The synovial joints are the most complex. They are the most freely movable. And let's get into it. So most of the joints in your skeleton are in fact types of synovial joints. All right, so most of the joints in your skeleton are synovial joints. All of these are diarthrotic, meaning that they are freely movable. Each of the synovial joints have particular structures that are common to all synovial joints. You have this articular cartilage. So cartilage where the two bones articulate, and that would be here and here. So this end of this bone articulates with this end of the bone. And so you have articular cartilage in between the two that help to decrease friction and make joint movement more smooth. You have the joint capsule. The joint capsule is this structure here that encapsulates or holds the joint structure in place. You have the synovial membrane. Synovial membrane is this membranous sac that surrounds this portion of the joint. Synovial membrane produces synovial fluid. The synovial fluid is what keeps this articular cartilage from touching and grinding on this articular cartilage. It allows friction-free movement in between the joints. You have the joint cavity. The joint cavity is the space inside the synovial membrane that is being filled up by the synovial fluid. Then you have the bursa in some joints, and you have menisci in some joints, and we'll talk about those a little bit later. Articular cartilage covers the articular end of both bones. So as I mentioned, you have this articular cartilage that is on the articular surface of the bones, and they help cover each end so you don't have that bone-on-bone friction. Each joint capsule has two distinct layers. You have that outer fibrous layer that is composed of ligaments. And if I go back, when you look at this joint capsule, this is that outer fibrous layer. All right, outer fibrous layer made up of ligaments. Remember, ligaments are the structures made up of dense connective tissue that hold bones together with other bones. Then you have that inner layer where you have the synovial membrane, and that synovial membrane is what secretes synovial fluid. So the inner second layer of this joint structure, the synovial joint structure, is this synovial membrane that secretes the synovial fluid in the joint cavity. These are other looks. This is a lateral view. This is an anterior or posterior view of a joint. And it shows you in this one, the right image, this shows you the extent of where and how the synovial membrane moves and what it looks like inside the complex joint structure. So now let's talk about the 6 different types of synovial joints. 6 types of synovial joints. They are classified by their shape and the movement allowed. So you have your ball and socket joints, and it looks like basically what it says. You have a ball that sits in a socket. You have the condylar joints. You have plane joints, hinge joints, pivot joints, and saddle joints. Now, if you click on this video, it gives further explanation about the different types of joints. So if you need or want to view that, learn more about the joints, then you have this video as one of those explanatory options. Now I'm going to stop here. I will start with the six, going more specifically into the six types of synovial joints in the next video.